pals, I'm here today to talk about my TBR for Q1 of 2025. So that includes January, February and March. So a few days ago I uploaded a 2024 wrap up and 2025 goals video. And one of the things I spoke about was the fact that I'd had lots of goals, like numbers based goals for 2024 that I'd kind of entirely forgotten about throughout 2024 and then failed them pretty spectacularly. So I wanted to try and achieve similar number-based goals, but there are some differences. And I thought a way of actually keeping track of that would be to make a quarterly TBR with books that would fulfill all those goals. And then when I do the TBR for the next quarter, I can kind of look back and see if I achieved the previous quarter. And that may mean if I'm behind, some quarters will have to have more books in than others. Hopefully that doesn't happen because I'm super excited about all these books. I will say that I'm not super strict, so I'm not going to be really annoyed with myself if I end up subbing some of these books out for other ones that I end up being more excited about. However, I am an avid library user, so much so that I have recently put on hold around 20 books and asked my library to buy 8. They agreed to all of them. So I've now got 28 books on hold, and my library charge you 60p per reservation, and so they have barred me from my account because I reserved all those in 2 days at home. I've not paid the charges, and so I've been barred, so I can't renew books. So yeah, I need to go into the library tomorrow, pay those charges, and then be allowed access again. But yeah, I always think it's funny when I'm such an avid library user, I go in twice a week and then they bar me, but it is what it is. So because I use the library, I plan ahead for the books I want to read, and so that does mean I'm more likely to read the books I'm talking about here because I am having to kind of seek most of them out from the library. Some of them I will audiobook or maybe pick copies up of them. So I'm going to talk about the non-fiction books first. So one of my goals was to read 12 non-fiction books in 2025, and by non-fiction I basically mean informative non-fiction, so stuff that isn't memoirs. That is a separate goal. So I've got 3 books for informative non-fiction. I really struggled to narrow this down because there's so many I'm interested in, but I've decided to prioritise these 3 for this first quarter. So these first 2, I heard some of my favourite booktubers talk about in their favourites of 2024, and this first one is one recommended by Rincey over at Rincey Reads, one of my favourite channels of all time. She's been doing booktube for longer than I have, so she's one of the people I watched and was inspired to start my own channel. And I think we have a lot of crossover in our reading taste. We both read a lot of literary fiction, but also read a bit of kind of fantasy and also non-fiction. And I just think this one sounds amazing, and always happy to hear Rincey kind of, promote a book. So it is called By the Fire We Carry, The Generations Long Fight for Justice on Native Land by Rebecca Nagel. It says it's a powerful work of reportage and American history that braids the story of the forced removal of Native Americans onto treaty lands in the nation's earliest days, and a small town murder in the 1990s that led to a Supreme Court ruling reaffirming Native rights to that land more than a century later. So what happened obviously in a lot of parts of the US is that Native Americans were forced to sign treaties which were either kind of falsified or, the US government went against those treaties in the future. Those treaties offered the Indigenous people a really small pocket of land compared to the land that they had once inhabited and travelled across. And what was supposed to happen is that within those reservations, state law wouldn't apply, and instead the reservation would have their own system of upholding the law. And in Oklahoma, over a century after these kind of treaties had been enacted, a Muskogee citizen was sentenced to death for murdering another Muskogee citizen on tribal land. His defence attorneys argued the murder occurred on the reservation of his tribe, and therefore Oklahoma didn't have the jurisdiction to execute him. Oklahoma asserted that the reservation no longer existed, and then in the summer of 2020 the Supreme Court settled the dispute, its ruling that would ultimately underpin multiple reservations covering almost half the land in Oklahoma, including Nagel's own Cherokee Nation. So I'm really interested in all this history. I've read a fair amount of books that are kind of more broad focused than this, but also I'm somebody who finds the court system, particularly these type of cases that change law, fascinating. I used to listen to a podcast, God, quite a few years ago. It was like the best podcast I ever listened to. I can't remember the name, I'll put it here. And each episode was about a case that had changed law and had gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. And a lot of them, in fact, were about racist laws that were being upheld. And it was, completely fascinating and infuriating, but really inspiring when they kind of managed to change law. So I think this is a book that I'll get a lot out of. And then we have a book that was published in 2016. I've had it on my TBR perhaps even since then, which is embarrassing. I just have an awful lot of books on my TBR, non-fiction especially, that I haven't got to. And it takes somebody kind of raving about it, who I really trust, to push it up my TBR. And I saw Audrey from Audrey Approved mention this in her favourite books of 2024. There's actually quite a few books in that list that I am going to endeavour to read this year. But the way she spoke about this one really convinced me that I did need to prioritise it. And that is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right by Ali Russell Hochschild. It says the renowned sociologist embarks on a thought-provoking journey from her liberal hometown of Berkeley, California, deep into Louisiana Bay country, a stronghold of the conservative right. As she gets to know people who strongly oppose many of the ideas she famously champions, she nevertheless finds common ground and quickly warms to the people she meets. Among them, a Tea Party activist whose town has been swallowed by a sinkhole caused by a drilling accident. People whose concerns are actually ones that all Americans share: the desire for community, the embrace of family, and hopes for their children. It says this book goes beyond the commonplace liberal idea that these are people who have been duped into voting against their own interest. Instead, she finds lives ripped apart by stagnant wages, a loss of home, an elusive American dream, and political choices and views that make sense in the context of their lives. So I think this sounds really interesting. She's written a couple of books that I'm interested in, but I'd like to prioritise this one because it's one of her earlier works. And the next book I've had on my list since it was longlisted, perhaps even shortlisted for the Stella Prize a few years ago, which is an Australian prize that promotes women's books by fiction and non-fiction, and that is See What You Made Me Do, Power, Control and Domestic Violence by Jess Hill. Now, I've been wanting to read this book. This is something that I think is of massive importance and something that is so infuriating in the fact that the stats are there to prove how high domestic violence is, how women are so often put through violence in their own home and from their intimate partners, and how that's not really being focused on in any way by many different nations' governments. This book in particular focuses on the Australian context, and I was looking to see if there was a book that focused on this in the British context. Couldn't easily find that, but I decided to go for this one because I heard loads of people rave about it at the time, but also because out of the books about this topic, it's one of the longer ones. And also a couple of the other ones, I saw people say kind of negative reviews saying that the writing wasn't that good, whereas I didn't hear that about this one. It says that 1 in 4 Australian women has experienced violence from a man she was intimate with. Investigative journalist Jess Hill puts perpetrators and the systems that enable them in the spotlight. This is a deep dive into the abuse so many women and children experience, abuse that is often reinforced by the justice system they trust to protect them. Critically, it shows that we can drastically reduce domestic violence, not in generations to come, but today. So I think this is going to be a really difficult read, but a book I have meant to read since I heard about it. And then another book I've had on my list since it came out is They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. So I stumbled across this book when it came out, back in 2017, because I follow this publisher quite closely, and I obviously saw this brilliant cover and also loved the title and looked into it. And I've always kind of intended to read it, but always been a little bit intimidated by it because this is a collection of essays that are kind of personal in nature, but touch on events that have taken place in the US, and particularly events that highlight the racism in the US. But they're told in the context of his relationship with music. And I'm somebody who enjoys music, but I'm the worst person at I can know the lyrics to a song, I can know a song, but I can rarely tell you who sung that song, what it's called, and what album it's on. My knowledge of music is really poor, and so I was a bit worried that this would be too niche focused on music, and I would just feel really unsure. However, I've recently heard people talk about his new book, which focuses on basketball, I think. heard it in so many people's best books of 2024, and everyone I've heard talk about it has said you do not have to be interested in basketball. He writes about it in a way that is like really poetic, and he ties it into the context of all the discussions he's having about contemporary America. And I thought, okay, I really want to read that, but I also want to go back and actually read the one I originally intended to read. And I think I'll have more of a link to music than I will to basketball, which I literally know nothing about. So it says that he uses music and culture as the lens through which to view our world so that we might better understand ourselves, and in so doing proves himself a bellwether for our times. Yeah, all three of his books have absolutely amazing like reviews and ratings, so I feel like this could be one I love, and I found it on Everand, an audio narrated by him, which I think will be a really good route to go. And the next one I stumbled across because my library has recently purchased a copy. I highly recommend checking your library's online catalogue and like clicking on new books if that's a feature available, because it's just, yeah, a great way of finding out about new releases. And I'm actually going to audiobook this one because the author narrates it, and I just think that's the best way to go with memoirs. And that is I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying by Young Ming Mei. And also this is supposed to be quite kind of comedic, and I think that comes across better when narrated by the author. It says, in I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying, Young Ming jokes through the retelling of her childhood as an offbeat biracial kid in Saipan, a place next to a place that Americans might know. She jokes through her difficult adolescence where she must parent her own mother, who married her husband because he looked like white Jesus. And with humour and irreverence and full-throated openness, she jokes even while sharing the story of what her family went through during the last century of colonialism and war in Korea, while reflecting how years later their wounds affect her in New York as a single mum, all the while interrogating whiteness, gender and sexuality. So yeah, that just sounds like the sort of memoir I absolutely love. Can't wait to read it. And then lastly for memoirs, we have a really beautiful book, and that is Slow Noodles, a Cambodian memoir of love, loss and family recipes by Chanta Gyun. I hope I said that name correctly. It says this is a beautiful and haunting memoir from a Cambodian refugee who lost her country and her family during Pol Pot's genocide in the 1970s, but who finds hope by reclaiming the recipe she tasted in her mother's kitchen. I haven't read any books about Cambodia, and I have several on my like non-fiction memoir TBR, and yeah, just haven't gotten around to them, and it's something I definitely need to fix. So when I heard about this one, I thought this is a really good one to give a go. This has over 20 recipes in them passed down from her family. So you follow her through the years of her life as she is displaced because of Pol Pot's regime, and yeah, the kind of years she lives in a refugee camp. But it says that through it all, she relies on her mother's slow noodles approach to healing and to cooking, one that prioritises time and care over expediency. Haunting and evocative, Slow Noodles is a testament to the power of culinary heritage to spark the rebirth of a young woman's hope for a beautiful life. And yeah, I think a lot of us love reading food writing, and yeah, this one again has amazing reviews. Okay, so those are my first two goals, that are the non-fiction related ones, to read 12 non-fiction books and 12 memoirs. So I hopefully will manage those 6 books and be on track. Now I have a couple more fiction related goals, but before I get onto them, I just wanted to mention 3 books that are on my TBR, not because of goals, but because we read them over on my Patreon book club. I thought I'd mention them for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I know I'm going to be reading them. I'm really excited about them, so I'd like to talk about them here. And secondly, in case you would like to join my Patreon, for $1 a month you get access to 4 videos. One is the book club, where I put up 2 books and you vote between the 2, and I try and have the books decided 3 months in advance so you have time to get hold of them. A currently reading video, a DNF video, and a wrap up where I talk about the films and TV I've watched that month, which I watch a fair amount of, and I had a really good year in 2024, so I'm hoping to make that even better in 2025. So yeah, I'm really excited about these 3 books, and in fact the 3 books that didn't win I'm also really excited about, so I may try squeeze them in 2, but we shall see. So for January I put up 2 small town stories against one another, and the one that won was Empire Falls by Richard Rousseau. I've heard loads about this author, and in particular this book. It came out in 2002, and I think it's the book that won him the Pulitzer Prize. It says, Empire Falls, a blue-collar town full of abandoned mills whose citizens surround themselves with the comforts and views provided by lifelong friends and neighbours who find humour and hope in the most unlikely places. This book is nearly 500 pages, which makes me happy. I like a kind of chunky novel, especially in this kind of small town setting. And I think this book kind of orbits around like a diner called the Empire Grill, and a man who works there, and kind of the people who he's connected to. So I think that sounds really interesting. I love small town stories, but I particularly like the idea of them kind of orbiting around a certain central location in that small town. So super excited for this one. I've also heard that it's been adapted, like I think a long time ago, into a HBO award-winning series. So let me know if you've watched that and if you would recommend it. Then we have Highway 13 by Fiona McFarlane. I put this up against another interlinked short story collection called The History of Sound by Ben Shattuck, which I will be audiobooking as soon as possible. But Highway 13, I'm really glad this one won. I think both of them sound amazing, but this sounds like a book that was written for the type of reader I am, because I am fascinated by this type of topic. And I think the way it's going to deal with these themes is going to be completely on point for kind of my interests. It says this is a gripping, enigmatic collection of linked short stories about the reverberations of a serial killer's crimes in the lives of everyday people. This is based on a real serial killer who in the late 90s was arrested and charged for a series of brutal murders. It says this collection takes murder as its starting point, but it unfolds to encompass much through the investigation of the aftermath of this violence across time and place, from the killer's childhood town to Texas, Rome and tropical northwest Australia. She presents an oblique, entrancing exploration of the way stories are told and spread, and at what costs. What damages, big and small, do these crimes incur? How do communities make sense of such atrocities? How does the mourning of family sit alongside the public fascination with terrible crimes? And can we tell true crime stories without centering the killers? This is a captivating account of loss and its extended echoes in individual lives. This is something I'm endlessly interested in, and kind of forced to confront more and more as true crime becomes even more prolific, and there's these kind of dramatized versions where people end up saying they like fancy the killer. It's all absolutely abhorrent. There's also a lot of true crime podcasts that deal with these topics in quite a horrible, humorous way, which I think is just abhorrent when you consider that, you know, these people who were killed were real, living, breathing people who have been through awful things, and also they have surviving friends and family who have to hear all this awful kind of media that's designed not to educate but to entertain. And so, yeah, it's something I'm really interested in interrogating, and I think this collection sounds like it's going to do it brilliantly, and I've heard, again, great reviews for this one. And then lastly, in March, we'll be reading Love After Love by Ingrid Persaud. I've heard amazing things about this. I've had it on audiobook for years, and I'm just frustrated with myself. So I think for March, I put 2 books that featured immigration that were kind of backlist titles. And yeah, really excited by this one. I've heard people talk about how wonderful this book is and how kind of heartbroken they felt and how attached to the characters. And this is about a family who I think live in Trinidad. We have a mother and her shy son and their lodger. And I think something happens. I think the son witnesses something which causes this kind of massive fallout, and he then leaves Trinidad to go to the US. And I think you perhaps hear the story from each perspective, and there's kind of going to be all these secrets uncovered. And I haven't looked into it too much because it was a book, when I heard people review it, I kind of didn't want to be spoiled for anything. I've heard nothing but amazing things about it, and she's recently had another book come out that I'm interested in, but I'm not letting myself pick it up until I've read this first one. Then back onto my goals. My next one was to read 12 short story collections in 2025, and I'm really excited about these 3. Again, this was a battle to narrow this down, but I've decided to try and prioritise these 3. This first one I am going to need to order because it is not published in the UK, but I'm super happy to do that because I loved this author's novel that came out last year, and that is Fire Exit. And the short story collection is Night of the Living Res by Morgan Talty. From the moment this was published, I had it on my short story list to pick up, and that's only been kind of emphasised by the fact that I really loved his novel. So again, don't really care what this is about, but similar to his novel, this is set in a native community in Maine, and it is about what it means to be Penobscot in the 21st century, what it means to live, to survive and to persevere after tragedy. And Fire Exit was just brilliant. It was kind of quietly devastating. It was really thoughtful and thought-provoking, and I had such a sense of place from it. Like, I can really picture the rooms that were described to me and the streets and the people, and so I just want to read everything he's written, and I think this one sounds brilliant. And then this next one I haven't even read the blurb of, so you might think, well, why is that on the list? But that's because a couple of years ago I read this author's new novel, The Raptures, and it was brilliant, and it really stood out to me because it was very unique. And so I stumbled across this one on my library's catalogue, and that is Quickly While They Still Have Horses, which is a brilliant title. And I was like, God, I'd meant to read more books from this author. I think she has a couple other short story collections out and a couple of novels. This is her most recent short story collection. Her books, I think, are all set in post-conflict Northern Ireland. And I just loved the tone of The Raptures. It was at once really kind of realistic and slice of life, but it was also kind of wacky and offbeat and humorous in the right way for me. I think humour is a really difficult thing to match to each reader's individual taste, but she's definitely someone who matches my taste in humour. And yeah, so I'm kind of up for reading more with her kind of offbeat, zany writing style. So I don't even need to know what these stories are about. I'm just excited to read more from her and then to continue on through her backlist. And then anyone would think I work for my library because I just seem to be promoting them. I don't work for them. I would love to. But this next book, I again was looking through the catalogue of books they'd recently purchased, and I saw this cover and this title and thought, that seems kind of familiar, and clicked on it and was like, oh my God, that was a collection that Tin House published last year. Tin House are a brilliant independent press in the US, and I really wanted to get hold of it, but I tried not to import too many books last year because it's expensive and I just couldn't afford to do it. But this book has now been picked up in the UK and published here with of course, a different cover. But I'm really excited to give this one a go from my library. It says it's a searing, unflinching collection of stories set in Nigeria that explores themes of community expectations, family strife, and the struggle for survival. It's a collection of 10 stories concerned with literal madness, but also those private feelings that, when left unspoken, can feel like a type of desire: desperation, hunger, fear, sadness, shame, longing. It says in vivid, evocative prose, she unravels the tensions between mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, best friends, siblings, and more, marking the arrival of an extraordinary new talent in fiction and inviting us all to consider why it is that the people and places we hold closest to us are so often the ones that drive us to madness. I think that sounds really interesting. And excited to give this one a go. So then the next goal was to read 12 fantasy books in 2025, although I kind of broadened that somewhat and said I wanted to read 12 fantasy worlds. So for example, if I read a trilogy, I won't necessarily count that as 3 books off the 12. I'll just count them as 1 because it's one world. And I did that because there's so many fantasy books I'm super excited to get to. I'm really in the mood for fantasy, so much so that I'm cheating somewhat, and I've got 4 books to talk about. Now, I have an excuse as to why I'm cheating, and that is because this first book I'm so excited to get to. This was a book I heard Rincey rave about. I think she did a full-length review, which I will link above. And again, she made this as a favourite book of the year. And I read a sample from the Kindle and really liked the writing style. So I immediately requested it at my library, but I'm like 12th in the queue. So I think it's perhaps unlikely that I will be sent this before the end of the first quarter, but I'm including it because my intention is to read it as soon as it arrives. And of course it could arrive in this first quarter. And that is Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. Fairly unique in that it is a standalone fantasy book, which is obviously not very common. It says, magic has made the city of Tehran an industrial utopia, but magic has a cost and the collectors have come calling. I think this follows 2 characters. We follow Shiona, who has been an orphan since the age of 4, and for 20 years she has devoted every waking moment to the study of magic, fueled by a mad desire to achieve the impossible, to be the first woman ever admitted to the high magistracy. It says that her new colleagues will stop at nothing to let her know she is unwelcome, beginning with giving her a janitor instead of a qualified lab assistant. What nobody realises is that Tomil, her janitor, was a nomadic hunter from beyond Tehran's magical barrier. 10 years have passed since he survived the perilous crossing that killed his family, but working for a high mage, he sees the opportunity to finally understand the forces that decimated his tribe, drove him from his homeland, and kept the Tiranesh in power. Through their fractious relationship, mage and outsider uncover an ancient secret that could change the course of magic forever if it doesn't get them killed first. So love the sound of that. Always like when it's kind of multiple perspective and you get to hear from more than one character in fantasy, and I think this one sounds really interesting. The next one is another recommendation from Rincey. She reviewed this, I think, early in 2024, and I've wanted to read it since then, but my library didn't have a copy and I didn't want to pay for a hardback because, to be completely honest, hardback books in fantasy are really uncomfortable to read because they're so big. So I've waited impatiently for my library to pick up a paperback copy, which they just have, and it is ready for me to go pick up tomorrow, and that is The Will of the Many by James Islington. I hear some people say Islington. This is the first book in a fantasy series. I'm always a little bit dubious about starting a fantasy series when only the first book is out, because usually by the time the next book is out, you need to like reread the first. But I just think this sounds so exciting. And I again read a sample and I felt immediately pulled in. So I've done so well to stop myself from reading this one for months, and just super excited to get to it. I have actually read a book by this author before. Years ago, I read The Shadow of What Was Lost, which was the first book in a trilogy, and in part, I loved it. But there was an element, a plot point that happened towards the end, which is something I just don't like really in fantasy, and which I won't spoil, but that kind of put me off reading the later books, so I thought that could have become a larger part of the text, but I'll perhaps give them another chance. But this, in a lot of ways, sounds quite tropey. But I think if tropes are done well, then it can be really successful because they're kind of comforting. And, tropes are tropes for a reason because a lot of people like to read them. So this is set in a world that I think is kind of inspired by ancient Rome. And we follow this man who, again, was orphaned, which is a common trope in fantasy. And he lives in a world where there's like this hierarchy of people. And I think the magic system is that each person holds like a certain level of power or like energy within them. And they have to like provide that to the ranks above them. And when the book opened, in the section that I read, which I was really intrigued by, we're following this man who works in this type of really horrible high security prison where people who are imprisoned are attached to this like machine that like siphons their power, and this guy who works there is having to kind of hide his past and his abilities for some reason, and there's this big kind of mystery about this world that's going to kind of unravel. I think part of it takes place in some type of training academy, which is something I actually quite enjoy in fantasy. So yeah, I'm just really excited to get through this one. Feel like this could be a book that I like storm through in like 3 days, even though it's really long. So I hope that happens. And this next one I've meant to read for quite a while. This actually came out in 2012, and that is Malice by John Gwynne. This is the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen trilogy. John Gwynne has several different fantasy series out, some that are connected, some that aren't. And I've heard nothing but amazing things about his books. A lot of my patrons have raved about this one on my Discord, and they have kind of similar fantasy taste to me. Again, I've read the Kindle sample, not all of it. I read like the first chapter or so, and I really like his writing style. And yeah, I've wanted to pick this one up. Again, this is waiting for me to pick up from the library tomorrow. And I don't really need to know much. I mean, fantasy books are quite hard to describe sometimes. My understanding is that, again, we follow, I think, a young boy in this one. I think he is quite young though, because in the section that opened the book, he was maybe around 10 or 11. And I think in this we follow several characters, and it's in this land where there's like loads of battles going on. It has a violent past that involves giant clans, and the giants are stirring anew, and there are sightings of giant worms. So yeah, I think this is kind of epic battle across the whole land type situation. And yeah, I just really want to read some of his books, but I think it's best to kind of start with the earlier ones and then move forward. And then lastly, this is the fourth one that's kind of going to step in the place of Blood Over Brighthaven if I can't get hold of it. We have The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless. This is the first book in a trilogy called Gale Song. Again, I've read a sample. I read samples for fantasy before I'm deciding to read them because I dislike an awful lot of fantasy books writing, and I really like the sound of this. It says it is a gripping new historical fantasy series that intertwines Irish mythology with real life history, which is something I love. It's set in 981 AD and is about this Viking king that has recently died, and we follow this woman who's part of this kind of immortal race, and she's kept her powers hidden. And I think we follow another woman who's really involved in the kind of royal family. So yeah, in this sample I read, we were kind of introduced to both of them, and I was immediately interested in both their stories and like the writing style. And this is a completed trilogy like Malice. So if I enjoy this one, again, I can carry on and read all 3 books. And yeah, I was initially pulled in by the cover and the title of this, but I've been hearing good reviews. So other than those books, I am intending to read my way through the Realm of the Elderling series. So I would be happy with myself if I managed to read the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy. To be completely honest with you, I really didn't like the 3rd book in that trilogy. Like, I listened to it, I think on like 3 times speed on Audible to get through it. I just really didn't like the way the narrative went. So I'm kind of dreading, I think that's kind of what slows me down with getting back to this world, because I didn't love that 3rd book and I know I've got to get through it and it's massive. But yeah, I want to read them because I like the first 2 and I love the next trilogy. So need to get through. But yeah, I'll be really happy if I manage to read the Farseer trilogy in this first quarter as well. So those are all the books I'm intending to read this first quarter in order to achieve my goals. I would love to know if you've read any of these books, and if so, what your thoughts were on them. And of course, let me know if you have any books that you're intending to read for this first quarter to meet any goals that you may have. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.